Welcome back to another edition of the Knight Report podcast. I'm your host, Mike Broadbent. Joining me is part-time co-host Alec Crouthamel. He was at Greg Schiano's weekly game presser today, so we'll go over everything that Greg Schiano said there. We'll go over what some of the opponents that Rutgers will see on their schedule in the near future did this past weekend, and a few other things. We're not going to do a full Virginia Tech preview. We have a preview coming up later in the week with the guys at Tech Sidelines again, so really excited for that. But before we get into anything, this podcast is once again presented to you by Knight and Day Apparel. Get ready for football and tailgating season with Knight and Day Apparel. Our apparel is designed to keep you comfortable and stylish from the pregame excitement to the final whistle. Whether you're grilling in the parking lot or cheering from the stands, our high-quality gear has you covered with the unbeatable comfort and team spirit. Use our promo code Rutgers Rivals to get 10% off your purchase. Score big this season with Knight and Day Apparel and keep chopping. All right, so Schiano typically doesn't say a whole lot at his game day pressers, and today was no different. But you were there. What were some of the things that you thought were interesting that Schiano said out of his presser?
One thing that I thought was a little interesting, he was asked about injuries again, as he always is. He was mostly asked, whether he feels better about the team's health now compared to with the bye already passed than he did coming into the season before the first two games. He said he felt a little bit better, which makes sense. I mean, with the bye, he said guys are going to start getting better in terms of health. I mean, getting guys like Wesley Bailey back is going to be huge. Hopefully, maybe Tyreen Powell, we still don't know. He once again he said, I'm not going to talk about things on the availability report. I'll just wait for that to come out, because he said some of the stuff he's not too sure about. Nothing really new there. He also had a cool story about Frank Beamer when he was at Virginia Tech. He was asked about, how last year he talked about Kirk Ferentz, and that's what he wants to build at Rutgers long term. And he was asked whether he felt the same about Frank Beamer when he was at Virginia Tech, and he said he didn't have too many memories of Frank Beamer when he was at Virginia Tech, because the overlap with Greg Schiano at Rutgers wasn't too big with Virginia Tech in the Big East. But he said he was always pretty nice, and he shared a cool story of when, whenever Schiano was a younger coach, like mid-30s, still didn't really have a whole grasp of what was, happening in college football at some of the coaching meetings in the league. Beamer would, take him aside, give him some advice, look out for this, look out for this. And he said that was that always stuck out to him, and he's always remembered it ever since. That was a cool story about Beamer. He also said something interesting. He's very complimentary of Virginia Tech. He said, if I'm remembering correctly, he said they probably have about 8 to 10 draft picks on their team. So he's very high on them, especially their skill position players. He said that, when Ali Jennings, the wide receiver, he talked to him when I forget if he mentioned whether he was transferring out of Old Dominion or if there was another year when he was thinking about transferring.
It was the ODU one.
That's what I thought. Okay, yeah. So when he transferred out of Old Dominion before he went to Virginia Tech, he said the coaching staff went down and talked to him. He really liked him, but ultimately chose Virginia Tech. So that was an interesting little note. He said during the bye week, they also got to do some recruiting. They actually missed out on recruiting after the Howard game because it was a Thursday game, but they still didn't have a weekend because they weren't allowed to recruit until September 1st. So they missed out on a little window there, but they've been catching up, and obviously with the bye, they got to a lot of recruiting. And I'm sure a lot of you saw yesterday or Saturday when Schiano flew down to visit Chase Linton, who Schiano's doing his best to bring him back. I don't know if it'll be successful, but we'll see. He flew down in the chopper as well, so that was pretty interesting to see. But yeah, pretty typical presser, just talking about the opponent, how Brent Pry's done a really good job at Virginia Tech. Seems like he's the right man for the job. Knew him at some point from when he was at Penn State. Talked about how they're starting to get healthier, and how all comes up. He did mention that this is probably a top 3 receiver unit that they will face as well. He didn't want to say that they were the best because he wasn't sure yet, but he said that they would definitely be in the top 3.
Yeah, just to add some more color, because I listened to the presser too. He said not only do they have 8 to 10 draft picks on this team, but they probably have another 5 to 10 guys who are free agents as well. So basically, he thinks half the starters or half the 2 deep is NFL level players. Another guy he mentioned specifically in the receiver group is their tight end, Stephen Gosnell, who his brother I think he's a graduate transfer. He's one of their top receivers as well. He didn't mention him specifically. He mentioned Jalen Lane, Ali Jennings, and Daquan Felton, but they have another Gosnell who made a crazy catch against Marshall as well. So they have a really talented receiving group. He also shouted out Vashal Tutin, who is a Jersey guy. He finally got going last week for Virginia Tech. He had 115 yards and 2 touchdowns in the game against Old Dominion. But yeah, I think this is typical Schiano coach speak. You never want to say anything that's going to give the other team any kind of bulletin board material. Schiano makes almost every opponent sound like they're the 86 Bear or the 85 Bears in one way or another. And it was no different for Virginia Tech. He also was very complimentary of Kyron Drones, talking about how the quarterback we played week one, the Howard quarterback, was one of the fastest quarterbacks he's seen in recent memory. He said, while Drones isn't quite that, he's got, every bit of the mobility at 240 pounds. So he's going to be a very hard guy to stop. And, the last time we played them was his first career start. And now he's got an additional 13 starts under his belt. So he's a much different player than he was this year than he was last year. So a lot of really high praise from Schiano towards the Virginia Tech coaching staff, group of players, and stadium as well. Lane Stadium, I think he was the last coach at Rutgers to coach at Lane, and he said while they didn't win, I think they put up a fight, but they ended up losing by like 4 or 5 touchdowns. But obviously a lot of focus on Virginia Tech. I think he said that they didn't really go hard in practice last week because he doesn't like the especially with guys who have had a lot of experience to kind of do a bunch of hitting in practice without a game at the end of the week. So it sounds like they had a bit of a light practice, and it makes a lot of sense because you have a bunch of guys who are dinged up. I think the 3 main ones that we want to keep an eye out for on the availability report this upcoming weekend: backup running back Sam Brown. I thought David Anderson made a great point on the Scarlet Faithful this past week when he said if he thought Sam Brown is going to be out for an extended period of time, you really want to have 3 running backs you feel good about. And so he thought you would have seen more running backs get some run against Akron last week, but we only saw 2 in Kyle Monungai and in I can't remember his name for whatever reason right now.
Antoine Raymond.
Antoine Raymond, yeah, geez. So that's one thing to keep an eye out for. And obviously Wesley Bailey is starting defensive end, who a lot of us thought would have a pretty nice pass rush season and might be the missing piece of the defensive line in terms of generating pass rush. And then, of course, the arguably the best player on defense last year, Tyreen Powell, who is still recovering from an Achilles injury. He has not been listed as out the last 2 weeks, I believe. At least last game, he was not listed as out on the availability report. So I feel pretty confident that he's going to play. And I'm more up in the air about the other 2 players. Anything else about the presser that you wanted to hit on before we move on to some of our future opponents?
Yeah, just to fact check Schiano on what he said about last time they went to Blacksburg. It was 2002. They did lose that game 35-14. So he was right about the 3 or 4 touchdown deficit. He said they put up a fight, which I mean they did. And just to go back into a bit of the time machine here, Ryan Cubitt threw for 222 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 picks. He also had 12 carries for negative 65 yards, which I'm assuming came from a lot of sacks, because for whatever reason, sacks count as rushing yards in college. He did mention that Aaron Martin had a lot of big catches. He did have the second most receptions with 4 catches for 30 yards, and he also scored a touchdown. Sean Tucker, who is now working in the athletics department, 3 catches for 15 yards. So that was good to see. Problem is they allowed 381 yards on the ground. So unfortunate there. Lee Suggs had 21 carries for 197 yards and 2 touchdowns. So that's really killed him. Just to look into the old time machine, for Rutgers fans all the way back to 2002 in Blacksburg. Raheem Orr had 2 sacks, and also forced 2 fumbles. Sean Seabrooks also had a sack. Gary Brackett had 8 tackles and a sack, and also recovered a fumble. So, always love to look in the old time machine.
And some of those names are really bringing me back to my early days as a Rutgers fan, even some beforehand. I think one of the first players I do remember in my fanhood was Sean Tucker, so that's pretty cool. But let's just kind of roll that right into more Virginia Tech talk. So Virginia Tech improved to 2-1 on the season with a win down in Norfolk against Old Dominion, Norfolk has been a house of horrors for Virginia Tech in recent memory. They signed a 10-year deal with Old Dominion for a home-and-home series, which Virginia Tech fans apparently in the moment hated and have only grown to hate even more, given how the team has performed against Old Dominion in recent years. So they get a win, but They were favored, I believe, by 17.5 in this game, so they cover the spread for the first time in the season by winning 37-17. This is a game, though, that it was kind of like a bit of an upside down game for them because Virginia Tech has started off slow the first two games of the season at Vanderbilt and also at home against Marshall. They both those games they had really big time scoring troubles early in the game. It was a much different story this past weekend against Old Dominion. Virginia Tech scored a touchdown on its first two drives to go up 14-0, but then things stalled. Virginia Tech then scored 6 points on their ensuing 8 drives, so they really hit a low point. I've watched basically every game or every snap of every game for Virginia Tech this year, so I feel unusually prepared to talk about them for once. But I know you kind of got to watch a little bit of this game, right, Alec? Is there anything that you noticed in this matchup that you think we should be concerned about, or you see as an opportunity for Rutgers to take advantage this weekend?
Well, I mean, we talked about it a little bit before with the presser, but Kyron Drones is definitely going to be a problem running the ball. He wasn't all that great passing the ball. He did have just 176 yards passing with a touchdown interception. He did have 117 yards rushing, although a lot of that came on a 53-yard run that he sprung free. Bayshaw Tutin's a really physical back as well. Like we said, Jersey guy. Like you mentioned, he had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, they have talent on the skill positions. Just for whatever reason, their offense just kind of looks disjointed at times. And their run defense, I mean, when you allow 243 yards on the ground to Old Dominion, there's a problem there. Now, Old Dominion's not a bad team per se, but when you are supposed to be a contender for the ACC and you're going up against some of these group of 5 games, you kind of can't really let those crooked numbers get on the board. I mean, Aaron Young had 17 carries for 67 yards. He led the team in carries. Bryce Duke had 4 carries for 85 yards, which was aided by a 48-yard run. So it's just like it wasn't overly inspiring, and their quarterback had 13 carries for 64 yards and a touchdown. He also had a long run of 65 yards. So it really was containing the big running plays was a problem for Virginia Tech in this game. And that's kind of what Rutgers has been able to improve on this year in terms of compared to last year in terms of springing free those big runs for Monungai. Because last year he had some really big runs, no doubt, but it wasn't game by game consistently he'd break off 40, 50 yarders. Whereas they've been able to do that this year, albeit against worse competition. But I mean, Virginia Tech struggled with that against Old Dominion, so it feels like Monungai should be able to break free some runs here as well, as long as he gets the holes to do so.
Totally agree. So Virginia Tech on the season is 113th in rushing defense out of 133 teams in terms of yards per game. They're allowing 190 yards per game on the ground. PFF has them ranked 101st out of 133 teams in their pass or their run defense metric. This is going to be a game that kind of suits a Schiano-led team, especially led by Kyle Monungai really well. I see this as an opportunity to really kind of wear them down. If you look at how Kyron Drones performed, I think this was his best game, but he has a bit of a fatal flaw in the way he plays football, where he doesn't really fit well in the structure of he doesn't really fit into a structure of like an offense that has a lot of structure. I said structure twice, but what I mean is he likes to extend plays a lot with his legs, even when there is a nice pocket. He likes to kind of turn everything into backyard football in a sense. Sometimes it works out for the best, where there was a play early on in this game where it was a bad snap, and so there's a fumble behind the line of scrimmage. Kyron Drones scoops it up, and he's rolling out to his right, and he's able to find Jalen Lane wide open on the side of the field for 46 yards. So that was a play that should have been like a 10-yard loss, possibly a turnover, and he turns that into a field-flipping 46-yard play. So that's the kind of the good with him. The bad is that he'll just he's not a check down guy. He's a big play hunter. He throws a lot of balls deep, and he's not the most accurate. So he often will, not take the easy layups for, the 3-point shot, if I have for lack of a better term. So I do think that Rutgers, if they're able to kind of keep him in the pocket, which is easier said than done, he's going to really struggle against our defense, especially our pass defense, because that's the strength of our defense this year and has been for a long time. Kyron Drones also didn't get sacked this past weekend, which has been a big problem. The offensive line on Virginia Tech has been shaky at best this year. They allowed 4 sacks versus Marshall, and they allowed another 4 sacks versus Vanderbilt. So I guess you could say they took a step forward, but they also might have taken a step back because their best offensive lineman, Xavier Chaplin, he got hurt in the pregame warmups. Brent Pry afterwards said he got kicked pretty good. The testing looked fine, but when they were trying to get him ready to go, he just didn't feel ready. So he ends up missing the game. He was their highest graded player. He's seen by their fan base as their best offensive lineman. He gets replaced right before kickoff. And then Ollie Jennings, who's their wide receiver 1, or at least in the depth chart, he's listed as their wide receiver 1. He gets banged up in this game, can't go in the second half. So they're kind of walking into the Rutgers game a little beat up as well. So while they did take some steps forward, I think there's still some easy pickings for them. Jalen Lane, he had 100 yards receiving in the first quarter, and then he only had 1 catch the rest of the game. And a lot of that was on busted plays. Like his touchdown reception, if you watch it, it's like a 25-yard reception, but it was like a blown coverage of all blown coverages. If the way that they showed it on TV is, when he caught the ball, you couldn't even see a Monarch defender in the camera view. He was that wide open. So in general, I don't think things are going to look as easy for them this upcoming week against Rutgers as they did against ODU. ODU now moves to 0-3 on the season, although they had some pretty strong performances early on. They almost beat South Carolina opening week at South Carolina, and South Carolina has shown themselves to be a pretty quality opponent this year. The other kind of note I have is they have a defensive end. His nickname's APR, but he had 4 sacks this past weekend. He was really just wrecking the game at points. But I think Virginia Tech has shown to be consistently inconsistent on offense, and that could come back to haunt them against Rutgers. And defensively, they are basically a run sieve. Like, we're going to be able to run against them. And if we're able to rattle Kyron Drones, I think this could be a long day for Virginia Tech. And I know that I said a lot there, but I kept looking back at my notes and it's like, oh yeah, I got to say that. What else did you notice about Virginia Tech?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that Greg Schiano mentioned in the presser. Antoine Powell-Ryland, APR. Even Greg was like, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. I know they call him APR, but you got to know where he is on the field at all times. And he absolutely wrecked Old Dominion's game plan. There were some updates on the injuries. So on Ollie Jennings, Brent Pry said he's got a tweak. I think he's going to be okay, but we weren't comfortable putting him back out there, and he was disappointed. So it seems like it's not a long-term thing, but of course this is right after the game. You never know how things could progress later in the week. And he said about Xavier Chaplin, he said, I think Xavier's fine. I think he'll be okay. He took a pretty good lick, and then they x-rayed it. It was clear, and he just couldn't go. So it seems like not too much of long-term injuries, but you never want to see those guys banged up, especially when they are 2 of your more important guys on the offense. So those are some injury updates from Tech Lunch Pail that I found. So, I mean, it looks like they'll be okay, but of course, it also takes them a little bit to ramp back up. And yeah, I mean, it's just, I think Rutgers, this game is built for them to win. Now, it's a matter of execution because it may be built for them to win, but also Virginia Tech has a lot of talent, like we said, in the skill position. So I don't think it's going to be an easy win for Rutgers, not in the slightest, especially going to Blacksburg. And while it's not that, 8 o'clock kickoff that everyone loves on prime time, it's still 3:30. Still going to be a lot of people there. It's still going to be a lot of Virginia Tech fans there, and they'll make it loud and tough to play in. So I think it's the game plan is there for Rutgers to win, but they have to take it from Virginia Tech.
Yeah, and Rutgers opened up in this game as a 4.5-point dog. Actually, they were a 5.5-point dog on some books, so they were between 4.5 and 5.5, and they've since moved down to 3.5 or 3 at most books. So the money is coming in on Rutgers. I've been reading up basically everything I can on Virginia Tech's boards. There was a collective shock about Virginia Tech being that big of a favorite. A lot of people were saying stuff like, I thought it would be the opposite, where Rutgers would come in as a 3.5, 4.5-point favorite. That's kind of how they view their team. I think in my opinion, if a group of fans is too high on their team, I don't really give that much credence because most fans are by definition probably too high on their team. But if a fan base is looking at a line and saying, how are we a favorite in this? That's usually a sign that I would trust that more than Vegas. And in this instance, I kind of agree. I don't know that they should be, if we're talking about the neutral field, usually get 3 points, that they would be a 1.5 point favorite on a neutral field. That to me doesn't make any sense. But regardless, I think it's still a strong bet if you have the ability to get into New York or Pennsylvania to make a money line bet on Rutgers. I think the last time I checked, it was a plus 125. I got a plus 160. I'm waiting till later in the week to get the alternate spreads, 2.5 and 6.5 points at least, as Rutgers' favorite. I feel really good about this game. Now, there's still a lot of unknown about it. Like we talked about the injuries. I think the other thing we got to talk about though is what has the coaching staff not been showing in weeks 1 and 2 that they're going to bust out against Virginia Tech? Because not only have they had time to get healthy, but they've had time to install more of that playbook. And I know you can't install like sections of that, but you can get those trick plays lined up. You can get those new formations solidified. And who knows, maybe they drilled the hell out of those plays in the off season, and they just didn't want to expose certain things to Virginia Tech ahead of their game. So I don't know. Maybe I'm irrationally high, but I feel really good about Rutgers coming out of Lane Stadium on Saturday with a win.
Yeah, no, I think it's there for Rutgers, like I said earlier. And I think a big part of that, like you mentioned, the playbook opening up, I don't think it's necessarily, when you think about opening up the playbook, it's not just those trick plays that you think about. It's also some of those plays where maybe we see a little bit more play action and looking to push the ball downfield off of that play action because they have an advantage in the run game and see if they can open some things up there. So it's just kind of those extra additions to certain plays that are already in there. Like instead of just a basic run left, maybe they do some kind of counter or a toss or something like that. Just kind of adding on to bit by bit things that you've already seen from them, and that maybe they can turn into big hitters.
Yeah, the perfect example of, well, I'll give you 2 examples. One was the fumble Ruski last year. They lined up in the same kind of power formation they ran all year, and then do the fumble Ruski, get 45 yards on a play nobody's expecting. And watching my Eagles the last couple of years, everybody knows when you line up in that tush push, you know exactly what's coming, except when they do a sweep to DeAndre Swift last year, and he scores an easy 10-yard touchdown. So those kind of plays you set up almost to kind of attack that in a different way later in the year are super important. And I wouldn't be surprised, like you said, if that's the case with some of their formations coming out of the bye. So let's move on to the opponent we'll face after Virginia Tech. The Washington Huskies moved to 2-1 on the season after a loss at the Seahawks Stadium, Lumen Field. I think it still is. You would know, Alec, because you're a big Seahawks fan. They lost 24-19 in a brutal loss for them in the Apple Cup. Washington State just kind of outclassed them from the start. They had the lead the entire game outside of a few minutes in the second quarter. Did you get a chance to watch any of this game?
Not too much. I watched a little bit. I guess first takeaway, I mean, Jake Dickert is a hell of a coach. I'm surprised, especially now that they are no longer in a power conference. Nobody has taken him from there. Things kind of spiraled last year towards the end of the year. I mean, they started out 4-0 after beating Oregon State. I want to say they were ranked 13th in the country, and then they lost to UCLA, and things kind of spiraled from there. They're 3-0 right now. I granted one of those games was Portland State, but they absolutely smacked Texas Tech last week, and now they take down Washington, their in-state rival. This is a heck of a team and a heck of a coach for Jake Dickert. But on the Washington side, very tough loss in your rivalry game. And there was one play in particular that stood out, and it was at the goal line. I think it was late in the game, and you have a 4th and goal, and let's see, I'm trying to find, here it is. Yeah, 4th and goal at the 1-yard line with a minute to go, and you're down by 5. And the play call is they run a speed option to the short side of the field, and it gets stuffed for a loss of 2 yards. Not exactly what you want to see there if you're Washington. They just haven't looked like world beaters so far, which, I mean, you can't really expect given how much they lost in the offseason. But, I mean, you get a 35-3 win over Weber State, which even then it took them a little while to get going. They looked pretty good, beating Eastern Michigan 30-9 last week, beating Cole Snyder and the Eagles. And then this week you fall to your in-state rival who you're supposed to have an advantage on. So I think this is definitely a beatable Washington team. It has just taken them a little while to actually get going on the season. Next up, they do have on Saturday at 7 p.m. they have Northwestern at home, and then they have to travel across the country to Rutgers. And Northwestern is going to be a very physical game as well, so they will definitely be in a tough spot physically. I'm sure that at least after playing Northwestern, they'll feel at least a little bit banged up. So I think the ball's in Rutgers' court to take this game as well and just ground game, just pound the rock once again, just do what you've always been doing, use that physicality in the trenches. I think it's set up pretty well for them. And I mean, they don't have to travel across the country as well.
Yeah, no, this is a game that I think Rutgers for sure will be favored in. And if things go as we expect against Virginia Tech, that is going to be an absolute madhouse of an environment on a Friday night. Should be nice weather. Probably will be the best environment for Rutgers since the 2014 season, whether you want to pick Michigan or whether you want to pick Penn State. Both those games were electric, and this game I see being just as electric, if not more, if Rutgers rolls into that game 3-0. And then if things go well, they might be 4-0 and facing off in a ranked battle with Nebraska. Because Nebraska, I think, has been one of the biggest overachievers so far in the Big Ten. They moved to 3-0 on the year. They defeated Northern Iowa. But to me, it's all about just the continued development of Dylan Raiola. I mean, he doesn't look by any means like a finished product, but he just looks very impressive for a true freshman. He went 17-23 for 247 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 pick. Just like, he's just so talented. Like, he is kind of just a guy that you could easily see going in the first round of the NFL draft whenever he's eligible. Hard to believe he's a freshman. But Nebraska seems like they got a good one. Matt Rule has shown he can turn around basically any program except for as long as they're in college ranks, I should say. So year 2 under Matt Rule has been very fruitful so far. What did you notice about the Cornhuskers this Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, they were playing Northern Iowa, and Northern Iowa was a pretty good FCS program, and I don't think there was any rumblings that they could pull off the upset, that they could at least keep it close, but Nebraska took care of business and took them down 34-3. Raiola looked good, not great, which you don't really need when you're going up against an FCS team, especially when you have a lot of weapons like Nebraska does. I mean, Dante Dowdle had 55 yards. Raiola himself had 13 yards on the ground. Then they put in Heinrich Harburg, I think is how you say his name, in the end of the game when it was already out of reach. They have a lot of different weapons. They have a lot of guys that they can go to. I don't know if they have a signature number one guy yet, but they have a lot of different guys that can just be there and make plays. So it's definitely going to be something to look out for, and they are very physical in the trenches too. I mean, we saw what they put up on national TV against Colorado. They absolutely owned Colorado's offensive line, which, to be fair, is a very bad offensive line, but I mean, they absolutely destroyed it, and they are very physical in the trenches, kind of what you'd expect from a Nebraska team. Maybe not in this day and age, but Rule absolutely knows what he's doing. That's going to be a really tough game. And I mean, they also have a ranked matchup this weekend. They have the Friday night national TV spot on Fox against Illinois, who also snuck into the rankings, which I don't know if it was deserved, but that's a conversation for another day. That'll be a really tough matchup. Another physical team as well. So I think that game is going to be telling a lot of where Nebraska goes from here. If Raiola kind of breaks out on that national stage, we could be seeing Nebraska shoot up into potential dark horse college football playoff consideration. If he falls flat, then maybe it's not as high as we once thought. But I think this Friday night, that's a game that you're going to want to watch to see what are we going to see from Nebraska, because it feels like Illinois plays kind of similarly to Rutgers. Yeah. And I guess if you want to scout at Illinois a couple months very early, you can, just to see what they're about as well. Luke Altmaier looks improved from last year. So if you want to scout out both those teams, definitely a game to watch on Friday night.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be tuning in. It's nice that there's a ranked matchup like in a Power 4 conference on a weeknight, even if it is kind of later in the week. But yeah, that'll be a big time matchup. It's very rare you get to scout 2 opponents at the same time, so it's cool that matchup will be happening. Nebraska will be playing a road game at Purdue. Purdue kind of had an epic pants pooping this past weekend against Notre Dame. They lost 66-7 after a big win the previous week. I thought Purdue would have a good chance at pulling the upset off against Notre Dame, but I clearly was wrong. They just got absolutely just bitch slapped in every definition of the term. So not a whole lot to talk about there. But the next opponent on Rutgers' schedule is the Wisconsin Badgers. They got their doors blown off by the Alabama Crimson Tide, 42-10. Some additional bad news is it looks like they lost Tyler Van Dyke for the season with a knee injury. Their backup, Braden Locke, didn't look good, but I mean, not many quarterbacks do look good against Alabama, let alone backup quarterbacks. What did you see in this Wisconsin game that maybe you feel good about for Rutgers and you feel that would give Rutgers some challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I watched the beginning of this game, and I watched when Van Dyke was in, then when he came out, and how Braden Locke looked. As expected going against Alabama, he didn't look great. I mean, he only completed half of his passes, 125 yards and a touchdown, didn't turn the ball over. I mean, Jaden Milroe looked excellent, as he usually does. He absolutely tore up that Wisconsin defense. The offense for Wisconsin just didn't look all the way there. I mean, Ches Malusi's solid. They have some solid options at wide receiver, but it just doesn't look like it's a fully fit offense. They just don't look like they're executing all that well. I saw some jokes about how you can't put Phil Longo in the air raid in Wisconsin and expect good results. I mean, that's just a classic ground and pound team Wisconsin is. And then the defense, I mean, they got completely torn up, especially on the ground. Now, Rutgers doesn't have that rushing option at quarterback like Alabama does with Jalen Milroe, but still, I mean, they got absolutely torn through. It was a rough game all around for Wisconsin, and now you're starting to see some people wonder, like, is the Luke Fickell era already headed south? And like, you never want to say that 3 games into your second season, especially when you make a blockbuster hire like Luke Fickell and bring in a blockbuster offensive coordinator like Phil Longo. So the vibes are not good for them right now. And then next up, they go to USC, so it doesn't get much better after a bye week this weekend for them. So they go to USC, and then they play at home against Purdue, which should be a get-right game. But they really have not looked dominant in either of their 2 wins either. I mean, they played South Dakota and Western Michigan. They didn't look all that great in those 2 games either, and then they get absolutely housed by Alabama. So things are not looking good at Wisconsin right now. The vibes are not very high. They have some time to get right, but it's going to be really tough. So I think it's there. It's an easier game for Rutgers than I thought, especially if Van Dyke is out for the year. Even before Van Dyke got hurt, I was watching this Wisconsin team and thinking Rutgers could actually take this. My prediction at the beginning of the year was they lose to Nebraska, they lose to Wisconsin, they lose to USC, and then they lose one in November, undecided on which one. And it's starting to look like Wisconsin might be a win based on how they've looked this year.
Yeah, not to toot my own horn, but I had them winning this game at the beginning of the year, and I had a similar setup as you, losing to Nebraska, losing to USC, and then my late game loss was Michigan State, which didn't really look like too great of a prediction after week 1, but after week 2, I'd say, Michigan State looks way better than I think people were expecting them to, which isn't a huge surprise to me, given that I think maybe I just have Jonathan Smith in super high regard, but I think he's a great coach, and he's making very quick impact on the team there. Let's move on to the next opponent, the UCLA Bruins, who Rutgers will be playing for their homecoming game on October 19th. I'm going to say this now. UCLA is the worst team in the Big Ten this year. They barely squeaked out a win against a terrible Hawaii team week 1. Then they just got their doors absolutely blown off at home versus Indiana, coming off a bye week for them. They lost 42-13. Now, Indiana is probably way better than most people expected coming into the season, but there's no reason that you should lose by 30 points to an Indiana team with basically an entire new team, an entire new coaching staff. To lose to them is one thing, but to get destroyed like they did is another. And their schedule is absolutely brutal. The next few games, they go to Death Valley to play the Tigers of LSU this upcoming weekend. Then they play Oregon at Penn State, home against Minnesota, who looks surprisingly good this past weekend. And then they come to Rutgers for homecoming. I think this is going to be an easy win for Rutgers on homecoming at this point. Did you watch any of the UCLA game, or you got any additional color for what you think of the Bruins?
I mean, I'm with you. They look absolutely awful. Ian Garbers is terrible. It just does not look good. It looks like they panic hired Foster. I don't think he is a complete disaster, but the program is just not in the right place right now. I didn't think they were even in a good place before Chip Kelly left. And now it just looks even worse. Indiana has been a surprise, I will say. They're getting a lot of hype now. I saw a tweet earlier today. I forget where it was from. I saw that they've had 22 possessions so far. 16 of them have been touchdowns. Two of them have been just go into the halftime locker room possessions. Um, I think they've punted like twice all year, something ridiculous like that. So they've looked solid on offense. Curtis Rourke has looked really good. I mean, they're a pretty good team. They're starting to get some hype. Just looking at the stats, I'm trying to find out if they have actually punted. ESPN's not showing it, but I think they punted like twice, but that's beside the point. Yeah, and UCLA looks terrible. I mean, I just don't know where the silver lining is for this team. I guess it's a Jalen Berger homecoming as well. They had the bye after Hawaii and then just got absolutely housed in this game. Like you said, it doesn't get any better. They go at LSU, then they host Oregon, at Penn State, home against Minnesota, and then at Rutgers. And then after Rutgers, they get a bye, thankfully. But then they have to go back to Lincoln to play Nebraska. So it just doesn't get any better. I don't know where the wins come for this team. Maybe Minnesota in the near future. Like, the problem is, like, between this most recent game and against Rutgers, Minnesota's the only unranked team that they play. So it's not good. Their last chance for a win might be against either Washington or against Fresno State, who they play in the last game of the season. But even Fresno State's a solid team as well. Were they one of the teams that got taken into the new look big Pac-12?
They were, yeah. So it's Fresno State's Boise State. It is San Diego State, and it is can't remember the fourth one, but yeah, they're one of the four.
Yeah, it's not good for UCLA. I don't know where they go from here.
They continue to fall downwards, and we'll see how they adapt to the Big Ten. It doesn't seem like a great fit for them so far. But for their crosstown rival, USC, who Rutgers plays after UCLA, they've adapted really nicely. Obviously, the big win in week 1 against LSU, or week 0, I think it was, against LSU. Week 1. No, it was week 1. They followed that up with a trouncing of Utah State, 48-0. They were on bye this past week, and they go to Ann Arbor for their Big Ten opener against Michigan. Michigan looks like absolute wet diapers. At least they did against Texas. They had, I guess, a nice bounce-back win this past weekend, but they did end up changing quarterbacks after the game. So this is one that, USC, you're kind of get a good idea of who they are as a team. Playing at Michigan, I think they'll end up winning. This is going to be a really tough game for Rutgers, obviously. So I don't have a whole lot of new notes on USC.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a really tough game. Miller Moss looks awesome so far. They're just a really good team. I think the adjustment that they needed to make was a little bit overstated. Now they still haven't played a conference game yet, so it's still a little bit too soon to say that. I think this Michigan game, again, is going to be really telling. Unfortunately, it's at the same exact time as the Rutgers game. It's on CBS, nationally televised. So if you want to go split screen, that would be a good way to go. And yeah, Michigan looks terrible as well. I mean, they haven't looked overly inspiring in any of their games so far. Like Fresno State, they got a 20-point win, which good for you, but you didn't start out very well. Texas got absolutely housed. I know I've said that a bunch of times now. And then you not squeak by, but you get a not great win against Arkansas State, who isn't that good either. And now, yeah, they're going to have Alex Orji start against USC. And, I mean, Davis Warren, to be fair, none of his passes hit the ground. He did throw 3 interceptions, but he also completed his other 11 passes for 122 yards.
It's always good to hear. Maybe not the interception part, but, yeah, he's just a guy who doesn't really offer really any upside. You need a guy who can at least be dynamic and make some plays, and Davis Warren will take what's out there if it's just a gimme, but he's not going to win you any big games as we've seen so far. So they made the move they had to. I was talking to my one buddy yesterday who's a Michigan fan, asking how that whole situation played out, and I think everybody was a little bit surprised because it sounded like Orji was making progress, and then he is basically not playing. He's playing in this like kind of weird package role, and I think they decided, let's just see what he's got, because this is the best option we have to win some big games this year. But that is all we've got. Like I said, later in the week, we will be doing a full preview of the Virginia Tech game, and we'll have our post-game show as well. Alec will be in Blacksburg for this game. How excited are you to get out to Blacksburg and see this game, see Lane Stadium? Just tell us a little bit about what your game plan is for this one.
Since the home and home got announced, I had that circled on the calendar as one that I want to go to, so I'm very excited. The Riot Squad's also making a trip. I will not be with them. I'm going to be covering the game, so look out for story, live updates, things like that. I will be in the press box for that one. Leaving at 7 a.m. At least the plan is right now. Leaving New Brunswick at 7 a.m. We're staying at an Airbnb. It's about 30 to 45 minutes outside of Blacksburg, so not too far. It could be worse. There are farther places to go, like Roanoke, I think, is an hour away. I'm sure that's where a good amount of people are staying too. And then staying over Friday, and then Saturday, obviously, game day. And then, depending on how the game goes, hopefully, maybe enjoy a Rutgers win or, be sad about a Rutgers loss. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But it should be fun. And then we leave Sunday morning. So very excited for the trip. If you're going down to Blacksburg and you see me at the game, feel free to say hi. Always love seeing Rutgers people down there, or down anywhere that's not Piscataway. So yeah, that's the plan for this weekend. Very excited, and it should be a fun trip.
And I didn't ask you this last time, but Alec has another podcast that he is the co-host of that was started up recently. Tell us a little bit about Sports Radio 1766.
Yeah, so Max Shiner, formerly of the Are You Screw podcast, well, technically still of the Are You Screw podcast. So the Sports Radio 1766 is technically, I like to call it a new media conglomerate, and the Are You Screw podcast is a part of it. So yeah, it's been going well so far. We've recorded some. We're actually going to record this week as well for Virginia Tech. We'll also be recording our simulated season, I believe, on Wednesday. I think that's going to be live as well on either YouTube or Twitch, but I'm sure we'll let you know about that either today or tomorrow. So yeah, we are in the first. I don't know if you saw the first simulated season. It was a bit of a disaster because it was just CPU versus CPU. And the CPU, in case you didn't know, in case our listeners or viewers didn't know, in EA Sports football games are not particularly bright. So it was kind of aggravating to watch. I don't think either quarterback threw for one passing yard in the first half of the Akron simulation.
Oh my god.
So we're changing it up. We are. I am going to call the plays this time, and then I'm going to put it on coach mode and just let them, do whatever. We'd love to take some suggestions as well. If there's enough, people watching, we'll let, some viewers call the plays as well. There's no way that could possibly go wrong. But yeah, it's been fun so far. So if you want to follow us, it's just Sports Radio 1766 on Twitter, and then on YouTube, and also all your podcasting places. So Sports Radio 1766 will be getting more stuff going this week after the bye. So yeah, it should be fun. And again, hopefully the simulated season goes better than it did last week, where it was a double overtime win for Rutgers against Akron. Hopefully they win at Virginia Tech this week.
Yeah, I hope so too. You guys do a really good job of that. You guys make your Rutgers coverage. It's just a lot of fun as opposed to the really dry stuff we do here. So definitely check them out. They've done a really good job in their first few episodes, and I'm sure they'll continue that as they move forward with their endeavor. But I want to thank everybody for listening. Like I said, expect a couple of other pods later in the week, and if there's any big news that breaks, we will have you covered as well. But for me and Alec, this has been another edition of the Knight Report podcast, signing off.